Picture this. It's 1875 in London. Gas lamps flicker against cobblestone streets as carriages clatter past grand townhouses. Inside these elegant homes, beneath layers of silk and propriety, hearts beat with the same passionate desires that have driven humanity since the dawn of time. Yet, this is the Victorian era time, when showing an ankle was scandalous, when a stolen glance could ruin a reputation, and when love itself was bound by rules so rigid they would make a military drill sergeant weep. Welcome to the most fascinating paradox in romantic history, an age that gave us some of the world's greatest love stories, while simultaneously creating the most elaborate system of romantic suppression ever devised. Tonight, we're pulling back the heavy velvet curtains of Victorian society to reveal the secret world that existed behind closed doors. World where passion burned as fiercely as the coal fires that heated their homes, but had to be hidden beneath layers of social convention thicker than a London fog. The Victorian era, spanning from 1837 to 1901, during Queen Victoria's remarkable 63-year reign, was a time of unprecedented change. The Industrial Revolution was transforming society. Cities were growing at breakneck speed, and the British Empire was reaching its zenith. Yet, for all this progress and power, when it came to matters of the heart, the Victorians created a system so complex, so fraught with hidden meanings and secret codes, that it makes modern dating apps look like child's play. But here's what makes this story truly captivating. Beneath all that propriety, the Victorians were some of the most romantic people who ever lived. They just had to be incredibly creative about it. They developed an entire secret language of flowers, where a single bloom could convey messages that would make a modern love letter blush. They wrote passionate letters that would spontaneously combust if written today, yet they couldn't even hold hands in public without causing a scandal. This is the story of how love found a way, how it always finds a way, even when society tries to lock it behind the most elaborate barriers ever constructed. It's a tale of stolen moments, secret glances, and the extraordinary lengths people will go to for love. It's about the gap between what society demanded and what the human heart needed, and how that tension created some of the most beautiful, tragic, and ultimately triumphant love stories in history. So settle in, because we're about to embark on a journey through drawing rooms and ballrooms, through secret gardens and hidden alcoves, through the pages of forbidden letters and the whispered conversations that took place when the chaperones weren't looking. We're going to discover how the Victorians turned romance into an art form precisely because it had to be hidden, how they made every gesture meaningful because so few were allowed, and how they proved that love, like water, will always find a way through even the smallest cracks in the wall of propriety. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Courtship: Rules, Restrictions, and Rituals. To understand Victorian romance, we must first understand the elaborate social machinery that governed every aspect of courtship. Imagine a world where every interaction between unmarried men and women was choreographed with the precision of a ballet, where a single misstep could destroy a reputation, and where the path to marriage was more heavily regulated than international diplomacy. The Victorian courtship system wasn't just strict. It was a masterpiece of social engineering designed to control every aspect of romantic interaction. At its heart was the concept of propriety, a word that carried the weight of moral law. Propriety wasn't just about good manners. It was about maintaining the very fabric of society. The Victorians believed that uncontrolled passion was dangerous, that it could tear apart the careful social order they had constructed. So they built walls, elaborate, beautiful, suffocating walls around love itself. Let's start with the most basic rule. Unmarried men and women could never, under any circumstances, be alone together. This wasn't a suggestion, it was an absolute law. A young woman couldn't receive a male visitor without a chaperone present. She couldn't walk alone with a gentleman, not even in broad daylight on the busiest street in London. The very idea of being unchaperoned with a man was so scandalous that it could ruin her reputation forever. making her unmarriageable and turning her into a social pariah. But who were these chaperones? Usually older women mothers, aunts, or family friends, whose job it was to ensure that nothing improper occurred. They were the guardians of virtue, the enforcers of propriety, and often, unknowingly, the greatest obstacles to true love. These women took their responsibilities seriously, watching every glance, monitoring every conversation, and ensuring that the distance between a courting couple never decreased beyond what was socially acceptable. The rules extended to every aspect of interaction. When a gentleman called upon a lady, there were specific protocols to follow. He had to be formally introduced. You couldn't simply approach a woman you found attractive. The introduction had to come from a mutual acquaintance of good standing. Once introduced, he could call upon her at her family home, but only during specific hours, typically between 5 in the afternoon. These visits were formal affairs, conducted in the family parlor with the door open and a chaperone present. Even the conversation was regulated. Certain topics were forbidden, anything too personal, too intimate, or too controversial. Politics, religion, and money were generally off limits. The weather, literature, music, and art were safe subjects. A gentleman couldn't compliment a lady too directly or too personally. Saying "you look beautiful today" would be scandalous. "That is a lovely dress" was acceptable. The difference between these statements might seem minimal to us, but to the Victorians, it was the difference between propriety and impropriety. Physical contact was even more strictly controlled. A gentleman could offer his arm to a lady when walking, but only if they were properly introduced and chaperoned. He could help her into a carriage or upstairs, but only with the lightest touch and only when necessary. Dancing was permitted, but only certain dances and only with gloved hands. The waltz, when it first arrived from Europe, was considered scandalously intimate because it required the couple to face each other and maintain close proximity throughout the dance. The engagement process was equally formalized. A gentleman couldn't simply propose to a lady. He had to first ask permission from her father or male guardian. This wasn't a formality. It was a business negotiation. Marriage in Victorian society was as much about financial and social compatibility as it was about love. Families investigated each other's backgrounds, financial situations, and social standing before giving their approval. Even after an engagement was announced, the couple's interactions remained heavily regulated. They might be allowed slightly more freedom, perhaps a walk in the garden with a chaperone following at a discreet distance, or a few moments of conversation without someone listening to every word. But they were still not permitted to be truly alone together until after the wedding ceremony. The wedding itself was the culmination of this elaborate process, but even it was governed by strict rules. The bride wore white, a tradition that Queen Victoria herself had popularized, symbolizing purity and innocence. The ceremony was formal, the reception carefully orchestrated, and the couple's departure for their honeymoon was often the first time they had ever been truly alone together. But here's where the story becomes fascinating. These very restrictions created an intensity of feeling that might not have existed otherwise. When every glance is monitored, a single look becomes electric. When you can't touch someone's hand, the accidental brush of fingers becomes a moment of profound connection. When you can't speak freely, every word carries extra weight. Every conversation becomes a careful dance of hidden meanings. The Victorians, perhaps more than any other society, understood the power of anticipation, the eroticism of restraint, and the way that barriers can intensify desire rather than diminish it. They turned courtship into an art form precisely because it was so difficult. Every gesture had to be meaningful because so few were allowed. Every word had to count because there were so few opportunities to speak freely. This system also created its own form of rebellion. Young people, being young people, found ways around the rules. They developed secret codes, hidden meanings, and elaborate systems of communication that allowed them to express their feelings despite the restrictions. They turned the very tools of propriety, flowers, books, music, even the arrangement of objects in a room, into vehicles for romantic expression. The result was a courtship culture that was simultaneously the most restrictive and the most romantic in history. It was a system that could produce both the most beautiful love stories and the most tragic ones, sometimes within the same relationship. It was a world where love had to be earned, fought for, and carefully cultivated, where it couldn't be taken for granted because it was never easily won. In a world where words of love could not be spoken freely, the Victorians created perhaps the most beautiful and elaborate secret language in history: floriography, the language of flowers. This wasn't simply a charming custom, it was a sophisticated communication system that allowed lovers to conduct entire conversations, express deep emotions, and even carry on passionate affairs, all through the careful selection and arrangement of flowers. Imagine receiving a bouquet and knowing that every bloom, every color, every ribbon, even the way the flowers were tied together, contained a specific message. Imagine being able to respond with your own carefully chosen arrangement, creating a dialogue that was both beautiful and completely hidden from the watchful eyes of chaperones and disapproving relatives. This was the reality of Victorian romance, where a single red rose meant "I love you," but a yellow rose meant friendship, and a white rose meant "I am worthy of you." The language of flowers had ancient roots, but it reached its most sophisticated form during the Victorian era. The practice was popularized by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who learned about it during her travels to Turkey in the early 18th century. She wrote about the Turkish salam, a complex flower language that allowed people to communicate through floral arrangements. By the Victorian era, this concept had evolved into an incredibly detailed system that was documented in numerous flower dictionaries and guides. But this wasn't a simple code where each flower had one meaning. The Victorian flower language was incredibly nuanced, with meanings that could change based on how the flowers were presented, what they were combined with, and even how they were held or worn. A flower given upside down could reverse its meaning entirely. A flower given with the right hand conveyed a positive message, while the same flower given with the left hand could be a rejection or warning. Let's explore some of the most important flowers in this secret vocabulary. The red rose, of course, was the queen of romantic flowers, representing passionate love and desire. But roses came in many colors, each with its own meaning. Pink roses represented grace and admiration. White roses symbolized pure love and innocence. And yellow roses indicated friendship or, in some contexts, jealousy. A bouquet of mixed roses could tell an entire story, perhaps red roses surrounded by white ones to say, "My passionate love for you is pure and true." But roses were just the beginning. Forget-me-nots meant true love and remembrance, a perfect flower for a lover going away on a journey. Violets symbolized modesty and faithfulness, making them a favorite among young women who wanted to express their virtue while still acknowledging romantic feelings. Daisies represented innocence and new beginnings, often given at the start of a courtship. Some flowers carried warnings or negative messages. Yellow carnations meant disappointment or rejection, while striped carnations indicated a refusal. Petunias symbolized resentment and anger, while orange lily represented hatred. A suitor who received a bouquet of these flowers knew exactly where he stood, without a single word being spoken. The meanings could become incredibly specific. Red tulips meant a declaration of love, but yellow tulips indicated hopeless love. A single daffodil meant chivalry and regard, but a bunch of daffodils could mean misfortune. Iris flowers represented messages and communication itself, making them perfect for including in any floral arrangement that was meant to convey a specific meaning. But the real artistry came in the combinations. Victorian lovers became masters at creating complex floral messages by combining different flowers. A bouquet might include red roses, passionate love, forget-me-nots, remembrance, and ivy, fidelity, to say I love you passionately. Please remember me, and I will be faithful to you. Add some white lily, purity, and the message became even more specific. My passionate love for you is pure. Please remember me, and I will be faithful to you. The timing of flower giving was also significant. Flowers given in the morning carried different implications than those given in the evening. Flowers presented during a formal visit had different meanings than those left secretly, where only the intended recipient would find them. A flower worn in the hair meant caution, while the same flower worn over the heart meant love. Even the way flowers were arranged could convey meaning. Flowers tied with a ribbon on the right meant yes, while flowers tied on the left meant no. Flowers presented upside down reversed their traditional meaning entirely. A red rose given right side up meant, I love you, but the same rose given upside down meant, I do not love you, or even my love for you is dying. The Victorian flower language also included herbs and other plants. Rosemary meant remembrance and was often included in bouquets from lovers who were separated. Mint represented virtue and wisdom, while thyme symbolized courage and strength. Even weeds had meanings. Dandelions represented faithfulness and happiness, while clover meant think of me. Women became particularly skilled at this floral communication. They would spend hours studying flower dictionaries, memorizing meanings, and planning their own floral messages. A young woman might wear a specific flower in her hair to send a message to a particular gentleman at a ball, or she might arrange flowers in her window in a way that conveyed her feelings to a suitor walking by. The flower language also allowed for incredibly subtle communication. A woman could express interest in a suitor by wearing flowers that meant, I think of you, or you are in my thoughts, without appearing forward or improper. She could indicate whether his attentions were welcome or unwelcome, whether she hoped for a proposal or preferred to remain friends, all without ever speaking directly about such intimate matters. Men, too, became fluent in this language. A gentleman might send a carefully chosen bouquet after meeting a young lady, using flowers to express his interest while remaining within the bounds of propriety. He could propose marriage with flowers, express his devotion, or even apologize for a misunderstanding, all through his choice of blooms. The flower language created opportunities for romantic drama that would make modern soap operas seem tame. Imagine a love triangle where each suitor sends different flowers, creating a floral battle for a woman's affections. Picture the heartbreak of receiving flowers that meant rejection, or the joy of discovering that your feelings were reciprocated through a carefully chosen bouquet. Some of the most passionate Victorian love affairs were conducted entirely through flowers. Lovers would exchange increasingly elaborate floral messages, building relationships and expressing emotions that they could never speak aloud. These floral conversations could go on for months or even years, creating a form of courtship that was both intensely romantic and completely proper. The language of flowers also provided a way for women to express agency in their romantic lives. In a society where they had little control over their own destinies, where marriages were often arranged and their opinions rarely sought, flowers gave women a voice. They could encourage or discourage suitors, express their own feelings and preferences, and participate actively in their own courtships, all while maintaining the appearance of passive femininity that society demanded. But perhaps most importantly, the language of flowers transformed every garden, every flower shop, every bouquet into a potential love letter. It made the natural world a participant in human romance, turning every bloom into a possible messenger of love. It created a world where beauty and meaning were inseparable, where the aesthetic and the emotional were perfectly combined. This floral language wasn't just a quaint Victorian custom, it was a sophisticated response to the restrictions of their society. It was a way of making the forbidden possible, of expressing the inexpressible, and of conducting the most important conversations of their lives in plain sight of everyone, while keeping them completely secret. It was, in essence, the perfect Victorian solution. Beautiful, proper, and utterly subversive all at once. If flowers were the secret language of Victorian romance, then letters were its passionate voice. In an age when lovers could rarely speak freely to each other, when private conversations were nearly impossible, and when physical separation was often the norm, the written word became the primary vehicle for romantic expression. Victorian love letters weren't just correspondence, they were lifelines, works of art, and sometimes the only way lovers could truly know each other's hearts. The art of letter writing in the Victorian era was elevated to heights that we can barely imagine today. These weren't quick text messages or casual emails. Victorian love letters were carefully crafted works of literature, written with the understanding that they might be read and reread hundreds of times, treasured for a lifetime, and possibly passed down through generations. Every word was chosen with care, every sentence constructed to convey not just meaning but emotion, and every letter was a small masterpiece of romantic expression. But writing love letters in Victorian society was fraught with danger and complexity. Letters could be intercepted, read by disapproving parents, or used as evidence of impropriety. A young woman who received passionate letters from a man could find her reputation ruined if those letters became public. A gentleman who wrote too boldly could be accused of improper conduct. Yet despite these risks, or perhaps because of them, Victorian lovers wrote some of the most beautiful and passionate letters in the history of romance. The process of letter writing itself was an elaborate ritual. The paper had to be of the finest quality, the ink carefully chosen, and the handwriting impeccable. The way a letter was folded, sealed, and addressed could convey meaning before it was even opened. A letter sealed with red wax might indicate passion, while black wax could suggest formality or even mourning. The choice of stationery, the color of the ink, even the way the writer's name was signed, all of these elements were part of the message. Victorian lovers developed elaborate codes and secret languages for their letters. They might use literary references that only their beloved would understand, quote poetry that held special meaning for their relationship, or develop private jokes and references that made their letters incomprehensible to anyone else. Some couples created actual codes using numbers or symbols to represent words, allowing them to write passionate letters that looked like innocent business correspondence to casual observers. The content of these letters reveals the depth of Victorian romantic feeling. Despite the reputation for emotional restraint, Victorian love letters are often breathtakingly passionate. Consider this excerpt from a letter written by a young Victorian gentleman to his beloved. "My dearest heart, every moment apart from you is an eternity of longing. I carry your image with me always, a sacred treasure that no earthly power can steal. When I close my eyes, I see your face. When I wake, my first thought is of you. You have become the very air I breathe, the light by which I see, the music that fills my soul." Women, too, wrote with remarkable passion, though they had to be even more careful about propriety. A young Victorian woman might write, "My beloved, your letter came to me like sunshine after the longest winter. I read it by candlelight, treasuring every word, and I confess that I held it to my heart, as if it were your dear hand itself. I dare not write all that fills my heart, for fear that my words might seem too bold, but know that you are my constant thought, my dearest hope, my sweetest dream." The frequency of letter writing in Victorian courtships was remarkable. Couples who were separated might write to each other daily, sometimes multiple times per day. These weren't brief notes, but substantial letters, often running to several pages, filled with detailed accounts of daily life, philosophical discussions, literary analysis, and passionate declarations of love. Reading these letters today, we get an intimate glimpse into Victorian hearts and minds that is far more revealing than any public behavior of the time. Letters also served practical purposes in Victorian courtship. They allowed couples to get to know each other intellectually and emotionally in ways that brief, chaperone visits never could. Through letters, lovers could discuss their beliefs, their dreams, their fears, and their hopes for the future. They could share their thoughts on books, music, art, and philosophy. They could reveal their true personalities in ways that formal social interactions made impossible. The anticipation surrounding letters was intense. Lovers would wait anxiously for the post, watching for the familiar handwriting of their beloved. The arrival of a letter was an event that could make or break a day. The absence of an expected letter could cause genuine anguish, while an unexpected letter could bring overwhelming joy. Victorian diaries are filled with references to the emotional impact of letters, the joy of receiving them, the agony of waiting for them, and the careful ritual of reading and rereading them. Some Victorian couples conducted their entire courtships through letters. Military officers stationed abroad, businessmen traveling for work, or families separated by distance might maintain romantic relationships entirely through correspondence. These epistolary romances could be incredibly intense, with couples falling deeply in love through words alone, sometimes marrying after meeting only briefly or not at all. The preservation of letters was taken very seriously. Lovers would tie their letters with ribbons, store them in special boxes, and treasure them as their most precious possessions. Many Victorian women kept their love letters for their entire lives, rereading them in old age and sometimes requesting that they be buried with them. These preserved letters now provide us with an incredibly intimate window into Victorian romantic life. Letters also played crucial roles in marriage proposals. A gentleman might propose through a letter, allowing him to express his feelings more eloquently than he could in person, and giving the lady time to consider her response carefully. These proposal letters were often masterpieces of romantic writing, combining passionate declarations of love with practical discussions of the future they hoped to share. The language used in Victorian love letters was often highly literary and poetic. Writers drew on the rich tradition of English poetry and literature, quoting Shakespeare, Byron, and other romantic poets to express their feelings. They used elaborate metaphors, classical allusions, and flowery language that might seem overwrought to modern readers, but was perfectly suited to the Victorian aesthetic of romantic expression. But perhaps most remarkably, Victorian love letters reveal the gap between public propriety and private passion. The same couples who could barely touch hands in public wrote letters that burned with desire and longing. The same society that forbade unmarried couples from being alone together produced some of the most passionate love letters ever written. These letters show us that beneath the rigid exterior of Victorian society beat hearts that were every bit as passionate as our own. The tragedy of Victorian letter writing was that many of these beautiful documents were destroyed. Families, concerned about propriety and reputation, often burned love letters after the writers' deaths. Entire romantic correspondences that might have rivaled the greatest literature were lost forever, leaving us with only fragments of what must have been an enormous body of romantic writing. Yet enough Victorian love letters survive to give us a sense of their power and beauty. They remind us that love has always found a way to express itself, regardless of social restrictions. They show us that the human heart, when constrained, often becomes more creative, more eloquent, and more passionate in its expression. And they prove that sometimes the most beautiful love stories are written not in grand gestures, but in quiet moments. With pen and paper, when lovers pour their hearts onto the page and send them across the miles to the one they love. In the gaslit ballrooms of Victorian society, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows on silk gowns and tailcoats, a different kind of romance unfolded. Here, within the confines of highly structured social events, young people found ways to express attraction, test compatibility, and fall in love, all while performing the elaborate choreography of proper society. The ballroom was both a stage for propriety and a playground for passion, where every dance was a conversation, every glance a message, and every stolen moment a treasure. The Victorian ballroom was a marvel of social engineering, designed to bring unmarried young people together while maintaining strict control over their interactions. These weren't casual gatherings, but elaborate productions that required weeks of planning, careful guest lists, and meticulous attention to protocol. A grand ball might host hundreds of guests with specific rules, governing everything from arrival times to departure etiquette. The evening began with formal introductions. A young lady couldn't simply dance with any gentleman who asked. He had to be properly introduced by a mutual acquaintance or the host. This system ensured that everyone knew everyone else's social standing and family connections. It also meant that every introduction was significant, every new acquaintance a potential romantic interest worth investigating. Dance cards were essential accessories for young ladies. These small booklets, often decorated with ribbons and attached to the wrist, contained spaces for gentlemen to write their names next to specific dances. A full dance card was a sign of popularity and social success, while an empty one could be a source of humiliation. Gentlemen would approach ladies early in the evening to request dances, and a wise young woman would carefully consider which invitations to accept. But the dance card system also created opportunities for romantic strategy. A young lady might save the most intimate dances, the waltz, for instance, for gentlemen she favored. She might accept multiple dances from the same partner, sending a clear signal of interest. Or she might strategically fill her card to avoid dancing with unwanted suitors, claiming that she was already engaged for every dance. The dances themselves were elaborate affairs, each with its own character and level of intimacy. The quadrille and cotillion were group dances that allowed for conversation and flirtation within a structured format. Partners would come together and separate in predetermined patterns, creating opportunities for brief exchanges of words or meaningful glances. These dances were considered quite proper, as couples were rarely alone and the movements were highly regulated. The country dance was livelier and more energetic, allowing for more playful interaction between partners. The minuet was formal and stately, perfect for displaying grace and refinement. But it was the waltz that truly revolutionized ballroom romance. When this dance arrived from Europe in the early 19th century, it caused a sensation and considerable controversy. The waltz was scandalous because it required partners to face each other throughout the entire dance, maintaining close physical proximity and moving in intimate harmony. Unlike other dances where couples came together only briefly, the waltz demanded sustained contact and coordination. The gentleman placed his hand on the lady's waist, a shocking intimacy in Victorian society, while she rested her hand on his shoulder. Their other hands were joined, and they moved together in a swirling romantic embrace that was unlike anything proper society had seen before. Conservative voices condemned the waltz as immoral and dangerous. They worried that such close contact would inflame the passions and lead to improper behavior. Some dancing masters refused to teach it, and some hostesses banned it from their ballrooms. But the waltz was irresistible. Young people loved the romance and intimacy it offered, and gradually it became accepted, though it remained the most intimate dance in the Victorian repertoire. For young lovers, the waltz was a precious opportunity for closeness that was impossible elsewhere in their lives. During those few minutes on the dance floor, they could hold each other, look into each other's eyes, and move together in perfect harmony. It was as close to a private moment as Victorian society allowed, and couples treasured these brief interludes of intimacy. The music itself played a crucial role in ballroom romance. Victorian composers understood the power of melody to stir emotions and create atmosphere. Waltzes were written to be romantic and dreamy, with flowing melodies that seemed to lift dancers off the ground. Polkas were bright and cheerful, perfect for light-hearted flirtation. Mazurkas had an exotic, passionate quality that added excitement to the evening. Musicians were carefully chosen for their ability to read the room and adjust the tempo and mood accordingly. A skilled orchestra leader could sense when the energy was flagging and introduce a lively polka, or recognize when the moment was right for a romantic waltz. The music wasn't just background, it was an active participant in the evening's romantic drama. Between dances, couples would promenade around the ballroom, or step onto terraces and balconies for fresh air and conversation. These moments were precious opportunities for more intimate discussion, though always under the watchful eyes of chaperones. A gentleman might offer to fetch refreshments for his partner, creating a brief moment of service and attention that could be deeply meaningful in the context of Victorian courtship. The supper interval was another crucial part of the evening's romantic choreography. Gentlemen would escort ladies to the dining room, and the choice of escort was significant. A young woman might accept the arm of her most favored suitor for this honor, or she might strategically choose someone else to avoid appearing too interested. The supper conversation was an opportunity for more substantial discussion than was possible during the brief exchanges between dance figures. Some of the most romantic moments occurred in the quieter spaces of the ballroom, the alcoves and window seats where couples might sit out a dance, the conservatories filled with exotic plants where the air was cooler and the atmosphere more intimate, or the libraries and drawing rooms where those who didn't dance might gather for conversation. The language of fans added another layer of communication to ballroom romance. Ladies carried elaborate fans that served both practical and communicative purposes. A fan held in the right hand in front of the face meant "follow me," while a fan held in the left hand in front of the face meant "I wish to be acquainted." A fan drawn across the cheek meant "I love you," while a fan twirled in the left hand meant "I wish to be rid of you." These signals allowed for complex communication across a crowded ballroom. The end of the evening brought its own romantic rituals. The final dance was often reserved for special partners, and the choice of whom to dance with last could send a powerful message. Gentlemen would escort their partners back to their chaperones, perhaps stealing a moment for a few private words or a meaningful glance. The departure ritual was elaborate, with formal thanks and hopes expressed for future meetings. Some ballrooms featured special romantic traditions. Leap year balls gave ladies the privilege of asking gentlemen to dance, reversing the usual protocol and creating opportunities for bolder romantic expression. Masked balls added an element of mystery and intrigue, allowing for more adventurous flirtation behind the safety of disguise. Garden parties and outdoor dancing added the romance of moonlight and fresh air to the evening's attractions. The impact of these ballroom encounters on Victorian romance cannot be overstated. Many lifelong love affairs began with a chance meeting at a ball, a perfect waltz, or a conversation during supper. The ballroom was where compatibility was tested. Could partners move together gracefully? Could they maintain interest in conversation? Did they share similar tastes in music and dancing? For many young Victorians, the ballroom was their primary opportunity to meet potential marriage partners and to experience the closest thing to intimacy that their society allowed. It was where they learned the arts of flirtation and courtship, where they tested their social skills and romantic appeal, and where they often fell in love. The ballroom also served as a training ground for marriage itself. The cooperation required for successful dancing, the need to read and respond to a partner's movements, the importance of grace under pressure, all of these skills translated directly to married life. A couple who could waltz beautifully together might well be able to navigate the more complex choreography of Victorian marriage. But perhaps most importantly, the ballroom proved that even within the strictest social constraints, romance could flourish. The very limitations that governed ballroom behavior, the formal introductions, the structured dances, the constant supervision, created a framework within which passion could safely express itself. The ballroom was proof that the human heart, like music itself, will always find a way to create beauty and meaning, even within the most rigid structures. Behind the elegant facades of Victorian propriety lay a world of forbidden desires, secret passions, and romantic relationships that defied every social convention of the age. While society demanded conformity to strict moral codes, human nature remained unchanged, and the very intensity of Victorian restrictions created an equally intense underground world of forbidden love. This shadow side of Victorian romance reveals the true cost of social oppression and the extraordinary lengths to which people would go for love. The most tragic figures in this hidden world were perhaps the star-crossed lovers whose affections crossed class boundaries. Victorian society was rigidly stratified, with clear divisions between the aristocracy, the growing middle class, and the working poor. Marriage across these boundaries wasn't just discouraged. It was considered a form of social suicide that could destroy entire families' reputations and fortunes. Consider the plight of a young aristocratic woman who fell in love with her family's tutor, or a wealthy merchant's daughter who lost her heart to a working-class artist. These relationships were doomed from the start, yet they occurred with surprising frequency. The very intimacy that education and artistic pursuits required created opportunities for emotional connections that society could never accept. These cross-class romances often played out like tragic novels. Secret meetings in gardens at dawn, letters passed through sympathetic servants, stolen moments in libraries or music rooms when the family was away. The lovers knew their relationship could never be acknowledged publicly, yet they couldn't resist the pull of genuine affection and compatibility. Many such relationships ended in heartbreak, with families intervening to separate the lovers, sometimes sending one party away permanently or arranging hasty marriages to more suitable partners. But some defied convention entirely. There are documented cases of aristocratic women who eloped with unsuitable lovers, accepting social exile and financial ruin for the sake of love. These women became cautionary tales, whispered about in drawing rooms as examples of what happened when passion overcame propriety. Yet their stories also inspired others, proving that even in the most restrictive society, some people would choose love over security. The married women trapped in loveless unions formed another tragic category of forbidden romance. Victorian marriage was often more about financial and social compatibility than emotional connection, and many women found themselves legally bound to men they could never love. Divorce was nearly impossible and carried such social stigma that it was rarely considered, even in cases of abuse or complete incompatibility. These women sometimes found themselves drawn to other men, perhaps a family friend, a neighbor, or someone they met in social circles. The resulting relationships had to be conducted with extraordinary discretion. A married woman who was discovered in an affair faced complete social ruin, loss of her children, and financial destitution. Yet some were willing to risk everything for the chance to experience genuine love and passion. The literature of the period is filled with stories of such relationships. The married woman who fell in love with her husband's best friend, the society matron who conducted a passionate correspondence with a younger man, the wife who found in another's arms the tenderness her marriage had never provided. These relationships rarely ended happily, but they reveal the depth of emotional starvation that many Victorian marriages created. Perhaps even more hidden were the relationships that challenged Victorian assumptions about sexuality itself. The era's rigid gender roles and expectations created particular difficulties for those whose desires didn't conform to social norms. Women who felt romantic attraction to other women had to navigate a society that barely acknowledged such possibilities existed, let alone accepted them. These relationships often disguised themselves as intense friendships. Victorian society actually encouraged close emotional bonds between women, seeing them as natural and proper. This created a protective cover under which deeper relationships could develop. Women could live together, share beds, a common practice due to limited space and heating, write passionate letters to each other, and display physical affection, all without arousing suspicion. Some of these relationships were undoubtedly what we'd now recognize as romantic partnerships. The letters between some Victorian women friends are filled with language that sounds unmistakably like love letters to modern readers. They wrote of longing, of physical desire, of jealousy when their beloved friends showed attention to others. They created households together, supported each other financially and emotionally, and lived as couples in all but name. The famous Boston marriages of the late Victorian period relationships between educated, Independent women who chose to live together rather than marry men represent one way that women found to create loving partnerships outside the constraints of heterosexual marriage. These relationships were often accepted by society as practical arrangements between spinsters, but many were clearly romantic partnerships that provided both emotional and physical intimacy. Men faced different but equally challenging restrictions. The Victorian ideal of masculinity was rigid and demanding, requiring men to be strong, stoic, and always in control of their emotions. Men who were naturally more sensitive, artistic, or emotional often struggled to fit these expectations. Some found solace in intense friendships with other men, relationships that could provide the emotional intimacy their society otherwise denied them. The boarding school system, which separated boys from their families for months at a time, created environments where intense emotional and sometimes physical relationships developed between male students. While society generally ignored or dismissed these relationships as temporary phases, for some they represented their first and most meaningful experiences of love and intimacy. The artistic and literary communities provided some refuge for those whose desires didn't conform to social norms. Artists, writers, and musicians often lived somewhat outside conventional society, and their communities were sometimes more accepting of unconventional relationships. The bohemian lifestyle that emerged in the later Victorian period created spaces where people could experiment with different ways of living and loving. Yet even in these more liberal circles, discretion was essential. The legal and social penalties for non-conforming sexuality were severe. Men could face imprisonment, social exile, and complete ruin if their relationships were discovered. Women faced different, but equally devastating consequences: loss of reputation, family rejection, and economic hardship. The international nature of Victorian society also created opportunities for forbidden romance. The British Empire's global reach meant that many Victorians traveled to or lived in distant colonies where social supervision was less intense and different cultural norms prevailed. Some found in these exotic locations the freedom to pursue relationships that would have been impossible at home. Colonial settings also created opportunities for relationships across racial boundaries, another form of forbidden love in Victorian society. While such relationships were strongly discouraged and often illegal, they occurred nonetheless. The isolation of colonial life, the different social dynamics of frontier societies, and the human tendency to form connections across cultural boundaries all contributed to these relationships. These cross-cultural romances faced enormous obstacles. Racial prejudice was deeply embedded in Victorian society, and relationships between white colonials and indigenous peoples were seen as particularly scandalous. Yet letters, diaries, and official records reveal that such relationships occurred throughout the empire, from India to Africa to Australia. Some of these relationships were exploitative, reflecting the power imbalances of colonial society. But others appear to have been genuine love affairs between individuals who found in each other qualities that transcended cultural differences. These couples faced not only social disapproval, but often legal barriers, as many colonies had laws prohibiting interracial marriage. The children of such relationships faced particular challenges, belonging fully to neither culture and often rejected by both. Yet their existence testifies to the power of love to overcome even the most fundamental social barriers. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of Forbidden's Victorian romance was the way it revealed the human cost of social oppression. The letters and diaries of those involved in Forbidden's relationships are filled with anguish, self-doubt, and desperate longing. They show people torn between their deepest emotional needs and their desire to remain respectable members of society. Many chose conformity, suppressing their true feelings and living lives of quiet desperation. Others chose love and paid the price in social exile, financial hardship, and family rejection. A few found ways to have both, conducting their forbidden relationships with such discretion that they maintained their social standing while finding private happiness. These stories remind us that behind every social system, no matter how rigid, are individual human beings with their own needs, desires, and capacity for love. The Victorian era's attempt to control and channel human sexuality and emotion was ultimately unsuccessful because it failed to account for the infinite variety of human experience and the irrepressible nature of love itself. The forbidden romances of the Victorian era also contributed to the eventual transformation of society. Each person who chose love over convention, each couple who defied social expectations, each individual who lived authentically despite the costs, helped to gradually expand the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. Their courage and sacrifice paved the way for the greater freedoms that subsequent generations would enjoy. The Victorian era was a time of unprecedented technological advancement, and these innovations profoundly transformed the landscape of romance and courtship. From the revolutionary impact of photography to the romantic possibilities of railway travel, from the intimacy of the telegraph to the democratizing effect of mass-produced books, technology gave Victorian lovers new tools for connection, expression, and romantic adventure. Understanding how these innovations shaped love stories helps us appreciate the dynamic nature of Victorian romance and its surprising modernity. The invention of photography in the 1840s created entirely new possibilities for romantic expression and connection. For the first time in human history, lovers could exchange exact likenesses of themselves, carry portraits of their beloveds, and preserve moments of their relationships forever. The impact of this innovation on Victorian romance cannot be overstated. Portrait photography became an essential part of courtship ritual. A gentleman might request a photograph of a lady he was courting, and the granting or refusal of this request carried significant meaning. To give someone your photograph was to offer them a piece of yourself, a token they could treasure and contemplate in private. These early photographs required long exposure times, meaning that subjects had to remain perfectly still for several minutes, creating images that captured a sense of solemnity and intensity that seemed perfect for romantic purposes. The carte de visite, a small photograph mounted on cardboard, became the standard format for romantic exchange. These pocket-sized portraits could be easily carried, hidden in lockets, or displayed in private albums. Young people collected photographs of their friends and romantic interests, creating visual records of their social circles and romantic histories. Photography also enabled long-distance relationships in ways that had never been possible before. A soldier stationed in India could send his photograph to his beloved in England, allowing her to see his face even when they were separated by thousands of miles. Emigrants to America or Australia could maintain visual connections with sweethearts left behind, making the pain of separation more bearable and the hope of reunion more vivid. The intimate nature of early photography created new forms of romantic expression. Couples would pose together for engagement photographs, creating formal records of their commitment. Some daring lovers even exchanged more personal photographs, though such images had to be handled with extreme discretion given Victorian moral standards. The development of the railway system revolutionized Victorian romance by making travel faster, easier, and more affordable than ever before. Suddenly, lovers separated by distance could visit each other with relative ease. A gentleman could court a lady living in another city, traveling by train for weekend visits. Families could maintain connections across greater distances, expanding the pool of potential marriage partners. Railway travel also created new opportunities for romantic adventure. The journey itself became part of the courtship experience. Couples could travel together, properly chaperoned. Of course, to visit friends or family, sharing the excitement of seeing new places and experiencing the romance of travel. The railway carriage, despite being a public space, offered a kind of intimacy that was difficult to achieve elsewhere. Hours of uninterrupted conversation while watching the countryside roll by. The railway also enabled the development of seaside resorts and spa towns as romantic destinations. Places like Brighton, Bath, and Scarborough became popular locations for courtship and honeymoons. The combination of beautiful scenery, leisure activities, and the slightly relaxed social atmosphere of holiday destinations created perfect settings for romance to flourish. Railway travel even influenced the pace and rhythm of Victorian courtship. The train schedule became a factor in romantic planning. Lovers had to coordinate their meetings with departure times, and the fixed nature of railway timetables added structure to romantic relationships. The anticipation of arrival and the sadness of departure became integral parts of the Victorian romantic experience. The telegraph, invented in the 1840s and rapidly expanded throughout the Victorian era, created possibilities for immediate long-distance communication that seemed almost magical to contemporary observers. For the first time, lovers could exchange messages across vast distances in a matter of hours rather than weeks or months. Telegraph messages, or telegrams, became a new form of romantic communication. The cost and public nature of telegrams, they were transmitted by operators who could read them, meant that messages had to be brief and carefully worded, creating a new art form of compressed romantic expression. Lovers developed codes and abbreviations that allowed them to communicate intimate feelings while maintaining propriety. The immediacy of telegraph communication added new intensity to Victorian relationships. A lover could send a message in the morning and receive a reply the same day, creating a sense of connection and immediacy that had never been possible before. This speed of communication also increased the emotional stakes of relationships. A delayed response to a telegram could cause anxiety, while an immediate reply could bring great joy. The telegraph also played crucial roles in romantic emergencies. A sudden illness, an unexpected opportunity, or a family crisis could be communicated immediately, allowing lovers to respond quickly to changing circumstances. Many Victorian courtships were shaped by telegraph messages that conveyed urgent news or important decisions. The expansion of printing technology and the growth of literacy created new opportunities for romantic education and expression. Mass-produced books became affordable for the growing middle class, and romantic literature flourished as never before. Young people could read novels, poetry, and advice books that shaped their understanding of love and provided models for romantic behavior. The proliferation of women's magazines created new forums for discussing romance and courtship. These publications offered advice on everything from proper behavior during courtship to the latest fashions for attracting suitors. They also serialized romantic novels, creating shared cultural references that young people could discuss and use as starting points for romantic conversations. The growth of the postal system, supported by new printing and transportation technologies, made letter writing more accessible and reliable. The introduction of the penny post in 1840 made sending letters affordable for ordinary people, while improved roads and railway connections made mail delivery faster and more dependable. This transformation turned letter writing from a luxury of the wealthy into a common form of communication available to all social classes. Gas lighting, and later electric lighting, extended the hours available for social activities and romantic encounters. Evening events could continue later into the night. Ballrooms could be more brilliantly illuminated, and the atmosphere of romantic gatherings was enhanced by the warm glow of artificial light. The ability to control lighting also created new possibilities for romantic atmosphere: dimmed lights for intimate conversations, bright illumination for dancing, and the dramatic effects of gaslight on evening dress and jewelry. The development of mechanical music boxes and player pianos brought music into domestic spaces in new ways. Couples could share musical experiences in their homes, and music became a more integral part of private romantic encounters. The ability to reproduce specific pieces of music meant that couples could associate particular songs with their relationships, creating personal soundtracks for their love stories. Even improvements in clothing technology influenced Victorian romance. The development of new fabrics, dyes, and manufacturing techniques made fashionable clothing more affordable and available. This democratization of fashion meant that more people could participate in the visual culture of romance, dressing attractively for courtship and expressing their personalities through their appearance. The invention of the safety bicycle in the 1880s created new opportunities for romantic adventure and independence, particularly for women. Bicycling became a popular courtship activity, allowing couples to explore the countryside together and enjoy a sense of freedom and adventure that was difficult to achieve in more formal social settings. The bicycle also gave women greater mobility and independence, changing the dynamics of courtship by allowing them to travel more freely. Photography, railways, telegraphs, and other Victorian innovations didn't just provide new tools for romance, they fundamentally changed how people thought about love, relationships, and the possibilities for human connection. These technologies compressed time and space, making long-distance relationships more viable and immediate communication possible. They preserved memories in new ways, allowing people to hold on to images and words from their loved ones. They created new forms of romantic expression and new opportunities for romantic adventure. Perhaps most importantly, these technological innovations helped to democratize romance. What had once been available only to the wealthy rapid travel, immediate communication, professional portraits became accessible to the growing middle class. This technological transformation helped to create the modern conception of romantic love as something available to everyone, not just the privileged few. The Victorian embrace of new technology in service of romance also reveals something important about human nature. Despite their reputation for conservatism and tradition, the Victorians were remarkably quick to adopt new technologies when they served emotional and romantic purposes. They understood intuitively that love would find a way to use any available tool, and they were willing to embrace innovation when it promised to bring lovers closer together. Victorian society's rigid moral framework created the perfect conditions for scandal, and when love affairs went wrong or relationships defied social conventions, the consequences could be spectacular, tragic, and far-reaching. These scandals didn't just destroy individual lives, they shaped public opinion, influenced social policy, and gradually transformed society's understanding of love, marriage, and personal freedom. The most notorious romantic scandals of the Victorian era reveal the enormous tension between human passion and social control, and show us how love, even when it fails, can become a force for social change. The divorce courts, established in England in 1857, became theaters of public drama where the most intimate details of failed marriages were exposed for all to see. Before this, divorce had been virtually impossible except for the very wealthy, requiring a private act of Parliament. The new divorce courts made legal separation more accessible, but they also created a new form of public entertainment as newspapers eagerly reported the salacious details of broken marriages. These divorce cases revealed the dark side of Victorian marriage and the enormous gulf between public propriety and private reality. The courts heard testimony about adultery, cruelty, abandonment, and incompatibility that shocked the public and challenged assumptions about the sanctity of marriage. Women who had been portrayed as angels of the domestic sphere were revealed to be capable of passion, deception, and rebellion. Men who presented themselves as pillars of respectability were exposed as adulterers, abusers, and hypocrites. One of the most sensational cases involved Lady Mordaunt, a young aristocratic woman who confessed to multiple affairs and was subsequently declared insane by her husband to avoid the scandal of divorce. The case dragged on for years, with lurid testimony about her relationships with various lovers, including allegations involving the Prince of Wales himself. The public followed every detail with fascination and horror, and the case became a symbol of aristocratic decadence and moral decay. The Mordaunt case also highlighted the impossible position of women in Victorian society. Lady Mordaunt had been married at 18 to a much older man in what was essentially a business arrangement between families. Trapped in a loveless marriage with no legal recourse, she sought affection elsewhere and was ultimately destroyed by the very system that had failed to protect her in the first place. Her story became a cautionary tale, but it also generated sympathy for women trapped in similar situations. Another category of scandal involved relationships that crossed social boundaries in ways that Victorian society found unacceptable. The affair between the famous actress Lily Langtry and the Prince of Wales created a sensation that rocked the monarchy and challenged assumptions about class and respectability. Langtry, known as the Jersey Lily for her extraordinary beauty, was a middle-class woman who became the mistress of the future King Edward VII. Their relationship was conducted with remarkable openness for Victorian standards. Langtry appeared publicly with the prince, attended royal events, and was widely acknowledged as his mistress. The affair lasted several years and made Langtry one of the most famous women in England. She used her notoriety to launch a successful career on the stage, becoming one of the first women to transform scandal into celebrity. The Langtry affair challenged Victorian assumptions about class, morality, and women's roles in several ways. It showed that a middle-class woman could captivate royalty through beauty and wit rather than birth. It demonstrated that scandal didn't necessarily destroy a woman's prospects. Langtry became wealthy and famous rather than ruined. And it revealed the hypocrisy of a society that condemned extramarital relationships while tolerating them when they involved powerful men. Literary scandals also captured public attention and influenced social attitudes toward love and marriage. The relationship between the poets Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning began as a scandal when Elizabeth eloped with Robert against her father's wishes. Their subsequent happy marriage and famous love letters helped to romanticize the idea of marriage based on love rather than family arrangement. More controversial was the relationship between George Eliot, Mary Ann Evans, and George Henry Lewes. Eliot lived openly with Lewes, who was married but separated from his wife, in what they considered a marriage in all but legal terms. Their relationship was condemned by respectable society, and Eliot was ostracized by many former friends and family members. However, their intellectual partnership and obvious devotion to each other gradually won over public opinion and helped to expand ideas about what constituted a legitimate relationship. The Oscar Wilde trials of 1895 created the most notorious scandal of the late Victorian era and had profound effects on attitudes towards sexuality and artistic freedom. Wilde's relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas led to his prosecution for gross indecency and his imprisonment for 2 years with hard labor. The Wilde scandal sent shockwaves through Victorian society and had lasting effects on how unconventional relationships were perceived and prosecuted. The trials were extensively covered in the press, and the details of Wilde's private life were dissected with prurient fascination. The case became a symbol of the conflict between artistic freedom and social conformity, between individual expression and collective morality. Wilde's downfall was particularly dramatic because of his previous celebrity status. He had been one of the most famous writers and wits of his generation, celebrated for his plays, his novel The Picture of Dorian Gray, and his brilliant conversation. His fall from grace was swift and complete. Within months, he went from being the toast of London society to a convicted criminal and social pariah. The Wilde trials also revealed the extent of underground networks of men who formed romantic and sexual relationships with each other, despite the legal and social prohibitions. The testimony exposed a hidden world of coded communications, secret meeting places, and elaborate systems of discretion that had allowed such relationships to flourish beneath the surface of respectable society. Perhaps most significantly, the Wilde case demonstrated the power of scandal to destroy lives while simultaneously advancing social understanding. Wilde's imprisonment and exile were personal tragedies, but his courage in living authentically, despite the risks, inspired others and gradually contributed to changing attitudes towards sexual diversity. Political scandals involving romantic relationships also shaped Victorian society and influenced the development of modern ideas about privacy and public morality. The case of Charles Stewart Parnell, the Irish political leader, and Catherine O'Shea created a crisis that destroyed Parnell's career and split the Irish nationalist movement. Parnell had been living with Catherine O'Shea for years while she remained married to Captain William O'Shea. When O'Shea finally sued for divorce in 1889, naming Parnell as co-respondent, the scandal erupted into public view. The case revealed that Parnell and Catherine had been conducting their relationship with the knowledge and apparent consent of her husband, who had benefited politically and financially from the arrangement. The Parnell scandal divided public opinion along moral and political lines. His supporters argued that his private life was irrelevant to his political effectiveness, while his opponents claimed that his adultery made him unfit for leadership. The Catholic Church condemned him, and many of his political allies abandoned him. Parnell's career was destroyed, and he died shortly after marrying Catherine following her divorce. The Parnell case raised important questions about the relationship between private morality and public service that continue to resonate today. It also demonstrated how romantic scandals could have far-reaching political consequences, affecting not just the individuals involved, but entire movements and causes. International scandals involving British subjects also captured public attention and influenced attitudes toward empire, race, and cultural difference. The case of Colonel Valentine Baker, a distinguished military officer who was convicted of assaulting a young woman on a train, created a sensation that revealed tensions about masculinity, military honor, and sexual propriety. Baker's conviction and dismissal from the army ended a brilliant military career and made him a social outcast in Britain. However, he was able to rebuild his life by accepting service with the Ottoman Empire, where he became a successful military commander. His story illustrated both the rigid nature of Victorian moral standards and the possibility of redemption through exile and service. The phenomenon of criminal conversation cases, lawsuits by husbands against men who had allegedly seduced their wives, provided another source of scandalous entertainment for the Victorian public. These cases treated adultery as a form of theft, with the husband seeking monetary damages for the loss of his wife's affections and services. Some of these cases involved enormous sums of money and revealed the sordid details of failed marriages and illicit affairs. They also highlighted the legal status of women as property rather than independent individuals. Since wives had no legal standing in these proceedings, they were treated as objects rather than participants in their own romantic lives. The reporting of these scandals in the popular press created a new form of public discourse about love, marriage, and morality. Newspapers competed to provide the most sensational coverage, and the public developed an insatiable appetite for intimate details about the private lives of the famous and notorious. This scandal culture had complex effects on Victorian society. On one hand, it reinforced moral standards by showing the consequences of transgression. The public humiliation and social destruction that followed exposure served as powerful deterrents to others who might be tempted to defy convention. On the other hand, the constant exposure to stories of passionate love affairs, unhappy marriages, and romantic rebellion gradually expanded public understanding of human nature and relationships. People began to recognize that the official moral code didn't reflect the reality of human experience, and that many of the most celebrated figures in society were living lives that contradicted their public personas. The scandals also revealed the enormous human cost of Victorian moral rigidity. The destroyed careers, broken families, and ruined lives that resulted from exposure showed that the system was often cruel and unforgiving. This recognition gradually contributed to demands for reform and greater tolerance for human frailty and diversity. Women involved in scandals faced particularly harsh consequences, but some managed to transform notoriety into opportunity. Actresses, writers, and other public figures sometimes use scandal to enhance their careers, trading respectability for fame and financial independence. This represented a new model of female agency that challenged traditional assumptions about women's roles and capabilities. The international nature of Victorian society also meant that scandals could have global implications. British subjects involved in romantic controversies in India, Australia, or other parts of the empire found their stories reported in newspapers around the world. These cases often involved complex questions of cultural difference, racial prejudice, and imperial authority. Perhaps most importantly, Victorian scandals served as catalysts for social change. Each major romantic controversy forced society to confront the contradictions between its official moral code and the reality of human behavior. The accumulation of these cases gradually eroded support for the most rigid aspects of Victorian morality and paved the way for the greater sexual and romantic freedom that would emerge in the 20th century. The legacy of Victorian romantic scandals extends far beyond their immediate impact. They established patterns of public fascination with celebrity relationships that continue today. They raised questions about the relationship between private morality and public responsibility that remain relevant in contemporary politics. And they demonstrated the power of love, even failed or forbidden love, to challenge social conventions and drive historical change. Chapter 8: The Art of Seduction, Victorian Strategies for Winning Hearts. In a society where direct romantic expression was forbidden and courtship was heavily regulated, the Victorians developed the art of seduction into a sophisticated science. This wasn't the crude manipulation we might associate with the term today, but rather an elegant system of subtle signals, meaningful gestures, and carefully orchestrated encounters designed to win hearts while maintaining perfect propriety. Understanding these strategies reveals the incredible creativity and psychological sophistication that Victorian lovers brought to their romantic pursuits. The foundation of Victorian seduction was the concept of accomplishments, skills, and talents that made a person attractive as a potential partner. For women, these accomplishments included musical ability, artistic talent, fluency in languages, and extensive reading. A young woman who could play the piano beautifully, speak French fluently, paint watercolors, and discuss literature intelligently was considered highly desirable. These skills weren't just ornamental, they were strategic tools for attracting and holding a suitor's attention. Musical performance was perhaps the most powerful of these accomplishments. A young woman who could sing beautifully or play the piano with skill and feeling had numerous opportunities to display her talents in social settings. The drawing room performance was a crucial moment in Victorian courtship, where a woman could demonstrate not just her technical ability, but her emotional depth and artistic sensitivity. The choice of music was itself a form of seduction. A woman might select pieces that showcased her vocal range and technical skill, but she would also choose songs that conveyed emotional messages to her audience. A melancholy ballad could suggest depth of feeling, while a lively dance tune might indicate a cheerful disposition. Some women became skilled at reading their audience and selecting music that would appeal specifically to the gentleman they hoped to impress. The physical aspects of musical performance also provided opportunities for subtle seduction. The graceful positioning of hands on the keyboard, the elegant posture required for singing, the expressive movements that accompanied passionate musical interpretation, all of these elements could be used to create an attractive and memorable impression. A skilled performer could use music to create an atmosphere of intimacy and emotional connection that was impossible to achieve through conversation alone. For men, the primary accomplishments were intellectual and professional achievements, physical prowess, and social skills. A gentleman who could discuss literature, politics, and current events intelligently, who had achieved success in his profession, and who could dance well and make witty conversation, was considered an excellent catch. Military service, travel experience, and athletic ability also enhanced a man's attractiveness. The art of conversation was crucial for both sexes. Victorian society valued wit, intelligence, and the ability to discuss a wide range of topics with knowledge and insight. A person who could make others laugh, who could tell interesting stories, and who could engage in stimulating intellectual discussion had significant advantages in the romantic marketplace. But conversation in Victorian courtship was far more complex than simple entertainment. It was a form of intellectual seduction that allowed people to demonstrate their compatibility and attract each other through the meeting of minds. A well-read woman could attract a gentleman by discussing his favorite authors, while a traveled man could captivate a lady with stories of exotic places and foreign customs. The strategic use of literary references was particularly important. Couples would quote poetry to each other, discuss novels they had read, and use literary allusions to convey feelings that couldn't be expressed directly. A gentleman might quote romantic poetry to suggest his feelings, while a lady might recommend a particular novel to indicate her interest in deeper acquaintance. Physical appearance and presentation were also crucial elements of Victorian seduction, though they had to be managed with great subtlety. The elaborate dress codes of the era provided numerous opportunities for strategic self-presentation. A woman's choice of colors, fabrics, and styles could convey messages about her personality, social status, and romantic availability. The language of fashion was incredibly sophisticated. Certain colors were associated with specific meanings. White suggested innocence and purity. Red indicated passion and boldness. Blue conveyed loyalty and constancy. The cut and style of a dress could suggest different aspects of a woman's character, from modest virtue to fashionable sophistication. Accessories provided additional opportunities for strategic presentation. Jewelry, gloves, fans, and hair ornaments could all be used to enhance attractiveness and convey subtle messages. A woman might wear a particular piece of jewelry that had been admired by a gentleman she hoped to impress, or she might choose accessories that complemented her best features. Men's fashion was more restricted, but still offered opportunities for strategic presentation. The quality of a man's tailoring, the elegance of his accessories, and his attention to grooming all conveyed messages about his social status, financial prospects, and personal character. A well-dressed gentleman demonstrated that he had the resources and taste to provide for a wife in appropriate style. The strategic use of social events was another crucial aspect of Victorian seduction. Skilled practitioners learned to use balls, dinner parties, and other gatherings as opportunities to advance their romantic interests. This required careful planning and social intelligence, knowing who would be present, understanding the social dynamics of the group, and positioning oneself advantageously. At balls, for instance, a woman might strategically fill her dance card to ensure she danced with her preferred partners at the most romantic moments of the evening. She might save the waltz, the most intimate dance, for the gentleman she most wanted to impress. She might also use her choice of dance partners to send messages to other suitors, accepting or declining invitations based on the signals she wanted to convey. The art of strategic positioning was also important. A woman might position herself near the piano if she hoped to be asked to perform, or she might linger near the refreshment table if she wanted to give a particular gentleman an opportunity to offer her assistance. Men learned to read these signals and respond appropriately, offering the right kind of attention at the right moment. Letter writing provided perhaps the greatest opportunities for Victorian seduction. Since letters were often the primary means of communication between courting couples, the ability to write engaging, witty, and emotionally compelling correspondence was invaluable. Skilled letter writers could use their correspondence to create intimacy, demonstrate their personality, and gradually win their beloved's affections. The art of the love letter involved much more than simply expressing feelings. Writers had to demonstrate their education and intelligence through elegant prose and literary references. They had to show their emotional depth through sincere and moving expressions of feeling. They had to maintain interest through wit, humor, and engaging storytelling. And they had to do all of this while remaining within the bounds of propriety. Some Victorian lovers became masters of epistolary seduction, creating correspondences that were works of art in themselves. They would share their thoughts on books, describe their daily experiences in entertaining detail, and gradually reveal their personalities and feelings through carefully crafted prose. These letters often became treasured possessions that were read and reread throughout the recipient's lifetime. The strategic use of gifts was another important element of Victorian seduction. The choice of appropriate gifts required careful consideration of the relationship stage, the recipient's preferences, and social conventions. Books were popular gifts because they demonstrated the giver's knowledge of the recipient's interests while providing opportunities for shared discussion. Flowers, as we've seen, carried elaborate symbolic meanings that allowed for complex communication. Music was also a popular gift sheet music for a favorite song, or perhaps a small musical instrument. These gifts had the advantage of providing ongoing reminders of the giver, as the recipient would think of them each time they played the music or used the instrument. The timing and presentation of gifts were as important as the gifts themselves. A gift given at the right moment could significantly advance a courtship, while the same gift given at the wrong time might seem inappropriate or presumptuous. Skilled practitioners learned to read the subtle signals that indicated when a gift would be welcome and what type of gift would be most effective. Perhaps most importantly, Victorian seduction required extraordinary patience and persistence. The elaborate courtship process could take months or even years, and success required the ability to maintain interest and momentum over extended periods. This meant developing strategies for keeping the relationship alive during separations, maintaining communication when direct contact was limited, and gradually building intimacy within the constraints of social convention. The most successful Victorian lovers were those who understood that seduction was not about manipulation or deception, but about presenting their best selves in the most attractive light while genuinely caring for their beloved's happiness and well-being. They used their accomplishments, their social skills, and their understanding of human nature to create relationships that were both passionate and proper, both exciting and respectable. The legacy of Victorian seduction strategies can still be seen in modern romantic culture. The emphasis on accomplishments and self-improvement, the importance of intellectual compatibility, the strategic use of social events, and the art of romantic correspondence all continue to play roles in contemporary courtship. The Victorians proved that even within the most restrictive social framework, creativity, intelligence, and genuine affection could find ways to flourish and triumph. The ultimate goal of all Victorian romantic endeavors was marriage, but the reality of married life often bore little resemblance to the passionate courtships that preceded it. Victorian marriage was a complex institution that served multiple purposes: economic, social, and emotional, and understanding how it actually functioned reveals both the achievements and limitations of Victorian romantic culture. The transition from courtship to marriage marked a dramatic shift in expectations, freedoms, and daily realities that could either fulfill or destroy the romantic dreams that had brought couples together. The Victorian wedding itself was a carefully orchestrated event that marked not just the union of two individuals, but the joining of two families and their social networks. The ceremony had evolved from relatively simple religious services into elaborate productions that could take months to plan and significant financial resources to execute properly. Every detail, from the bride's dress to the wedding breakfast menu, carried social significance and reflected the family's status and aspirations. Queen Victoria's own wedding to Prince Albert in 1840 had established many of the traditions that became standard for Victorian weddings. Her choice to wear white rather than the traditional silver or other colors started a fashion that spread throughout society and became symbolic of purity and new beginnings. The elaborate ceremony, the formal photographs, and the romantic narrative surrounding the royal couple's love match created a template that ordinary couples aspired to emulate. But for all their romantic symbolism, Victorian weddings were also business transactions. The legal and financial arrangements surrounding marriage were complex and heavily favored men. Under the doctrine of coverture, A married woman's legal identity was essentially absorbed into her husband's. She could not own property, sign contracts, or even keep her own earnings without his permission. Everything she brought to the marriage, money, property, personal belongings, became his to control. This legal framework meant that marriage negotiations often resembled business deals more than romantic arrangements. Families would investigate each other's financial situations, negotiate dowries and settlements, and draw up detailed contracts governing the distribution of property and income. A woman's portion, the money and property she brought to the marriage, was a crucial factor in determining her attractiveness as a bride, sometimes more important than her personal qualities or the couple's emotional compatibility. The honeymoon, a Victorian innovation that became increasingly popular throughout the era, represented an attempt to bridge the gap between romantic courtship and married reality. These trips, which could last anywhere from a few days to several months, depending on the couple's resources, provided newlyweds with their first opportunity to be truly alone together and to begin adjusting to their new relationship. Honeymoon destinations became increasingly elaborate as railway travel made distant locations more accessible. Couples might travel to the seaside, to the continent, or even to exotic locations within the British Empire. These trips served multiple purposes. They provided privacy for the couple to consummate their marriage away from family scrutiny. They offered opportunities for shared adventures and experiences, and they created romantic memories that could sustain the relationship through future challenges. But honeymoons also revealed the enormous gap between Victorian romantic ideals and sexual realities. Many couples entered marriage with little or no knowledge of sexual intimacy. Young women, in particular, were often completely unprepared for the physical aspects of marriage, having been taught that such matters were too delicate for discussion. The wedding night could be traumatic rather than romantic, and many couples struggled to establish physical intimacy within their marriages. The Victorian emphasis on female purity and innocence, while creating romantic ideals, also created practical problems for married couples. Women who had been taught to suppress all sexual feelings suddenly found themselves expected to respond to their husband's desires. Men who had been taught to respect female virtue sometimes found it difficult to reconcile their romantic idealization of their wives with their physical needs and desires. Once the honeymoon ended and couples settled into married life, they faced the challenge of maintaining romantic connection within the constraints of Victorian domestic arrangements. The doctrine of separate spheres assigned husbands and wives to different realms of activity: men to the public world of business and politics, women to the private world of home and family. This separation could strengthen marriages by giving each partner clear roles and responsibilities, but it could also create distance and misunderstanding. The Victorian home was designed to support this separation while providing spaces for family togetherness. The drawing room served as a formal space for entertaining guests and conducting family business. The morning room or breakfast room provided a more intimate setting for family meals and casual conversation. The library or study gave the husband a private space for work and contemplation, while the morning room or boudoir served similar purposes for the wife. These domestic arrangements could either support or undermine marital happiness, depending on how couples navigated them. Some found ways to maintain intimacy and connection despite their separate spheres, creating partnerships that combined romantic love with practical cooperation. Others grew apart as their daily lives diverged and their shared experiences diminished. The arrival of children added new dimensions to Victorian marriages, often strengthening emotional bonds while creating new stresses and challenges. Victorian families were typically large by modern standards, and the constant cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and child-rearing dominated many women's lives for decades. The high rates of infant and child mortality meant that families also faced frequent grief and loss, experiences that could either unite couples in shared sorrow or drive them apart in blame and despair. Victorian marriage also had to accommodate the reality that many couples had. married for practical rather than romantic reasons. Arranged marriages were still common, particularly among the upper classes, and many couples entered marriage as strangers who had to learn to love each other, or at least to live together harmoniously after the wedding rather than before. Some of these marriages developed into genuine love matches as couples discovered shared interests, compatible personalities, and mutual affection. Others remained cordial but distant partnerships focused on fulfilling social obligations and raising children. Still others became sources of misery and conflict that could last for decades, since divorce remained difficult and socially unacceptable for most of the Victorian era. The double standard that governed Victorian sexual morality created particular challenges for married couples. While wives were expected to remain faithful and pure, husbands often felt entitled to seek sexual satisfaction outside marriage if their wives were unresponsive or unavailable due to pregnancy or illness. This double standard could poison marriages and create cycles of guilt, resentment, and emotional distance. Yet many Victorian marriages did achieve the romantic ideals that the culture promoted. Couples who had married for love often found ways to maintain and deepen their emotional connection throughout their lives. They created partnerships that combined passion with companionship, romance with practical cooperation. Their letters and diaries reveal relationships that remained vibrant and loving for decades, proving that Victorian romantic ideals could be realized within the constraints of Victorian social structures. The key to successful Victorian marriages often lay in couples' ability to adapt their romantic expectations to married realities while maintaining the emotional connection that had brought them together. This required maturity, flexibility, and a willingness to grow and change together over time. It also required finding ways to express love and affection within the formal structures of Victorian domestic life. Some couples maintained romantic traditions throughout their marriages, continuing to exchange love letters when separated, celebrating anniversaries with special gifts or trips, and finding private moments for intimate conversation and physical affection. Others developed new forms of romantic expression suited to married life-shared intellectual interests, collaborative projects, or family traditions that reinforced their bond. The most successful Victorian marriages were often those that managed to combine the era's ideals of romantic love with its practical requirements for social and economic partnership. These couples found ways to be both lovers and partners, maintaining passion while building stable homes and raising successful children. Their relationships provided models for how romantic love could be sustained and deepened within the institution of marriage. The legacy of Victorian marriage continues to influence modern relationships and social expectations. The romantic ideals that the Victorians developed, the emphasis on emotional compatibility, the importance of shared values and interests, the expectation that marriage should provide both practical support and emotional fulfillment, remain central to contemporary ideas about successful relationships. At the same time, the Victorian experience reveals the importance of adapting romantic ideals to practical realities. The couples who found lasting happiness were those who understood that marriage required ongoing effort, compromise, and growth. They recognized that the passionate intensity of courtship would necessarily evolve into something different but potentially deeper and more sustaining over time. As we draw the curtains on our journey through the secret world of Victorian romance, we find ourselves confronting a remarkable paradox. The very society that created the most restrictive rules about love also produced some of the most passionate and enduring romantic traditions in human history. The Victorians, in their attempt to control and channel human emotion, inadvertently created a romantic culture of extraordinary intensity, creativity, and beauty that continues to influence our understanding of love today. The Victorian era proved that love, like water, will always find a way through even the smallest cracks in the wall of social convention. Faced with elaborate restrictions on courtship, impossible barriers to free expression, and rigid moral codes that seemed designed to suppress passion, Victorian lovers responded with remarkable ingenuity. They created secret languages of flowers that could convey the deepest emotions through a simple bouquet. They wrote letters that burned with passion while maintaining perfect propriety. They transformed every social gathering into an opportunity for romantic connection and every gesture into a potential declaration of love. Perhaps most remarkably, the Victorians understood something about romance that our modern age, with all its freedom and openness, sometimes forgets: that obstacles can intensify desire rather than diminish it, that anticipation can be more powerful than immediate gratification, and that love earned through patience and persistence can be more precious than love easily won. The very restrictions that seemed designed to prevent romance actually created conditions that made every romantic moment more meaningful, every gesture more significant, and every expression of love more treasured. The elaborate courtship rituals of the Victorian era, the formal introductions, the chaperoned visits, the carefully orchestrated social events, created a framework within which love could develop gradually and deeply. Unlike our modern culture of instant connection and immediate gratification, Victorian courtship required time, patience, and genuine effort. Couples had to truly get to know each other, to build relationships based on intellectual compatibility and emotional connection rather than physical attraction alone. This slower pace of romantic development often resulted in relationships that were built on solid foundations of mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection. The Victorian emphasis on accomplishments and self-improvement meant that people approached courtship as better versions of themselves, having developed their talents, refined their manners, and cultivated their minds in preparation for love. The Victorian understanding of romance as an art form, something that required skill, creativity, and dedication to master, also created a culture that valued romantic expression and emotional sophistication. The ability to write a beautiful love letter, to choose meaningful gifts, to conduct oneself gracefully in social situations, and to express deep feelings through subtle gestures were all considered essential life skills. This created a society where romance was not left to chance, but was actively cultivated and refined. The tragic stories of forbidden love that we've explored, the cross-class romances, the trapped marriages, the relationships that defied social convention, remind us of the human cost of social repression. Yet even these stories contributed to the eventual transformation of society. Each person who chose love over convention, each couple who defied expectations, each individual who lived authentically, despite the costs, helped to gradually expand the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. The scandals and controversies of the Victorian era, while destroying individual lives, also served as catalysts for social change. They forced society to confront the contradictions between its official moral code and the reality of human behavior. They revealed the hypocrisy of a system that demanded perfection while being administered by imperfect human beings. And they gradually built support for greater tolerance, understanding, and freedom in matters of the heart. The technological innovations of the Victorian era, photography, railways, telegraphs, and improved printing, didn't just provide new tools for romance. They fundamentally changed how people thought about love and relationships. These technologies compressed time and space, making long-distance relationships more viable and immediate communication possible. They preserved memories in new ways and created new forms of romantic expression. Most importantly, they helped to democratize romance, making what had once been available only to the wealthy accessible to the growing middle class. The Victorian legacy in modern romance is profound and enduring. The white wedding dress, the diamond engagement ring, the romantic honeymoon, the emphasis on emotional compatibility in marriage, all of these traditions trace their origins to Victorian innovations. The idea that marriage should be based on love rather than economic necessity, that couples should be intellectually and emotionally compatible, that romance should continue throughout married life. These concepts, which we now take for granted, were largely Victorian inventions. But perhaps the most important legacy of Victorian romance is the understanding that love is worth fighting for, that it deserves to be celebrated and cultivated, and that it can triumph over even the most formidable obstacles. The Victorians faced restrictions and limitations that we can barely imagine, yet they created a romantic culture of extraordinary richness and beauty. Their example reminds us that love is not just a feeling but an art, not just an emotion but a skill, not just a private experience, but a force that can transform society. The secret world of Victorian romance teaches us that passion and propriety need not be enemies, that restriction can coexist with creativity, and that the human heart will always find ways to express itself, no matter what barriers society may erect. It shows us that romance is not diminished by formality, but can be enhanced by it. That anticipation can be more powerful than immediate gratification, and that love that must be earned and fought for can be more precious than love that comes easily. As we face our own challenges in modern romance, the paradox of choice in online dating, the difficulty of forming deep connections in an age of instant communication, the challenge of maintaining relationships in an increasingly mobile and fragmented society, we can learn from the Victorian example. Their emphasis on self-improvement, their understanding of romance as an art to be cultivated, their patience in building relationships, and their creativity in expressing love within constraints, all offer valuable lessons for contemporary lovers. The Victorians proved that love is one of the most powerful and persistent forces in human experience. No amount of social control, moral regulation, or legal restriction can ultimately suppress it. Love will always find a way to express itself, to connect hearts across any divide, and to create beauty even in the most unlikely circumstances. Behind the veil of Victorian propriety, we have discovered not the cold, repressed society of popular imagination, but a world burning with passion, creativity, and romantic longing. We have seen how ordinary people transformed the constraints of their society into opportunities for extraordinary romantic expression. We have witnessed the power of love to inspire art, drive social change, and create meaning in individual lives. The secret world of Victorian romance reminds us that love is not just a personal experience, but a cultural force. Not just an individual emotion, but a social phenomenon that shapes and is shaped by the societies in which it occurs. It shows us that every age must find its own ways to express and celebrate love, working within its constraints while pushing against its limitations. Most importantly, the Victorian experience teaches us that love is always worth the effort, worth the patience required to cultivate it, worth the creativity needed to express it, worth the courage demanded to defend it, and worth the sacrifice sometimes necessary to preserve it. Behind their veil of propriety, the Victorians understood this truth and lived it fully, creating in the process some of the most beautiful and enduring romantic traditions in human history. Their legacy lives on in every love letter written, every romantic gesture made, every couple who chooses love over convenience, and every person who believes that romance is not just a luxury, but a necessity of the human heart. The secret world of Victorian romance may be hidden behind the mists of time, but its lessons remain as relevant and powerful today as they were more than a century ago. Love, as the Victorians knew so well, is indeed eternal, and it will always find a way.